Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohanec, and today on the podcast, we are turning the tables, a little switcheroo, and I'm going to be sharing a podcast that I was on, that I was interviewed for, an interview of me on the Animal Liberation Hour podcast. That podcast is hosted by Michele Granberg of Animal Activism Collective. Animal Activism Collective is who hosts the Animal Liberation Hour podcast. And in this interview, you're going to hear me a little more unscripted, a little raw and unedited. I spend a lot of time refining and cultivating what I want to say on this podcast, especially if I have a longer commentary, like in the beginning, or for an intro, or for a solo show. But I didn't really prepare specifically what I was going to say for this interview. It's one of those long form interviews like I do for my guests, like I have on this podcast with our guests. And so it was pretty off the cuff and raw. But you'll hear some of my stories of my activism origin stories back in the 90s and early 2000s, my radical direct action days, and get to know me a little bit more. I also talk about some of my favorite subjects like humane washing, the humane hoax, speciesism, the spiritual connection to veganism with Ahimsa and nonviolence. And the host, Michele, is really awesome too. Her commentary is wonderful. She was a fantastic host. I do these interviews several times a year, and I rarely share them here on my own podcast. But this one was really well done. Michele did a great job. She asked good questions and had some nice follow-up thoughts. So I felt like this was one worth sharing. So, just a reminder about our upcoming online Humane Hoax Project panel. This is a discussion that we're having on July 19th with a fantastic panel of experts that are going to be sharing their thoughts on the current political situation and its effect on animals and animal agriculture from the perspective of humane washing and the humane hoax. We have John Sanbonmatsu, who was our guest on the last episode of this podcast, Vasile Stanescu, and Catherine Gillespie. I think it's going to be a really great event. The registration link is in the show notes, so be sure to register and join us for our Humane Hoax Project panel discussion on Saturday, July 19th. Okay, so here's my interview from the Animal Liberation Hour podcast. I hope you enjoy it.
Hey, animal allies. Welcome to another episode of the Animal Liberation Hour, where we seek insight from animal rights and liberation activists who inspire us to get active for animals worldwide. Our guest on this episode is Hope Bohanec, author and animal advocate. I'm Michele Granberg. Before we get into the episode, a little bit about AAC. AAC is a multinational program created to encourage activists to reach their potential and equip them with the tools, community, and resources they need to boldly participate in our global animal liberation movement. Please visit our website and follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and reach out to us to apply to become a mentor or a mentee. So now to our guest, Hope Bohanec. Hope is an author, and in this episode, we chatted about the humane washing and greenwashing, as well as compassion, Ahimsa, and so much more. Please enjoy my conversation with Hope Bohanec. Hey, Hope. It's so nice to have you join me. Welcome to the Animal Liberation Hour.
Thanks for having me, Michele. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, we've spoken before, and there's so much to talk about. So I had to have you on. There's so many things to talk about, so many things that I consider you to be a resource, a well of knowledge around. So I'm so appreciative of that, what you're putting out into the world. So let's start with, what is your animal activist origin story? In other words, why did you become interested in being a voice for animal liberation?
Yeah, so interestingly, I have always said that I was going to work for animals in some way. When I was a little girl, you know how people ask, oh, what are you going to do when you grow up, right? To little kids. My mom said that long ago, even before I remember, that I would always say that I was going to work with animals and didn't know what that was going to be or how that would manifest. But getting into my teens and my rebellious side, I got into activism. I got into different forms of activism, and the animals really called me. I went vegetarian at 16, and then vegan at 20, and that was in 1990. And the animals were just really, really calling me. I was doing environmental activism at the time, Earth First up in the Pacific Northwest, protecting the redwoods from being cut, the ancient redwood trees from being cut down. There was a lot of very radical activism happening up there, and I was very drawn to it. We were doing, lockdowns and blockading logging roads and living 100 feet up in the tree sits in the trees. It was very exciting. And I felt very energized and enlivened, for the first time in my life. Like I had purpose. But the farmed animals were just calling me that whole time. And I was vegan at the time, and a lot of us were. But the farmed animals, for some reason, I felt were really the most exploited and also least seen, right, of the all the issues that were happening. And in my mind, I mean, that's how it felt to me, like that nobody knew their suffering. And I felt very drawn to want to tell and offer people their story. So I brought the Earth First tactics, some of these radical blockading tactics, down to Sonoma County, California, where we blockaded slaughterhouses and did just very radical, crazy activism. This is through the 90s when I was with SPAR, Sonoma People for Animal Rights, there in Sonoma County. One time we filled barrels with concrete, and then they had these metal sleeves through the sides, like you cut holes, put metal sleeves. I learned all this from Earth First Tactics. And you'd put your arm in the sleeve, and then you would handcuff yourself into this barrel of concrete. So it was very, very, very hard for law enforcement to move you. And then we'd set those concrete barrels right in front of like the slaughterhouse doors so they couldn't bring the animals in, things like that. Anyway, interesting stuff. I mean, we didn't have social media back then, so like nobody knows we did all this, right? And we couldn't afford cameras or video cameras, so we often didn't even have a video camera. But it was intense, and I ended up in, court a lot, and suddenly my whole calendar was filled with court dates from arrests. So my pendulum kind of swung to the other side, and I got into legislation activism, where I was working with HSUS, and I was on one of the very first long ago cage-free attempts, Proposition 2, back in like 2007, I think it was, in California. I worked with that for a while and didn't really feel that that was where my path was either. And so my pendulum kind of swung right to the middle, and I started doing vegan education and giving talks about veganism and doing leafleting and tabling. And that's where I really I really resonated. I felt that my strengths were in the storytelling, in the talking to people. And that's kind of where I've been ever since.
Wow, I love that because I didn't know all that. How would I, right? But I love your journey and your timeline and your history. And it's so interesting probably for you to hear yourself say it, how things zigged and zagged, but you're perfectly positioned where you are now. And all of that brought you to where you are. And I always believe that we have some destiny broadly, right? Right? That it's not fixed or locked or etched in stone, but it would just seem that those early glimpses and prophetic feelings like my life has a purpose already inherent, and I'm going to find that purpose, and that purpose is going to find me. We're going to definitely circle back to the animals, but before that, I want you to just touch on, because fast forward to now, you started a nonprofit. Like that's part of your platform for all the other branches of things that you do. So can you say a bit about your organization, Compassionate Living? Why did you form it? What's the mission and vision?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you talked about destiny, and your destiny. And I definitely felt that working with animal issues. And in the Dharma traditions, and we may get into talking a little about this because I'm very into the Dharma traditions and spirituality, there is a term called your swadharma. And that's kind of like what your purpose is, what you were put here to do. And I definitely feel that my swadharma was to help animals. So yeah, compassionate living, I started compassionate living during the pandemic. The pandemic, I think that for a lot of us, those first few months and years of the pandemic, a lot of us kind of had kind of existential crisisy, kind of stuff, right, going on. Like there was lots of life and death and upheaval and that kind of energy. And for me, what kind of happened was I started really looking at the timeline of my life and how much longer I had on this planet. And I had always wanted to start a nonprofit. I had always wanted to do my own nonprofit because I had these issues that to me were very, I felt important, timely, and that people weren't putting enough attention onto. So I was like, well, it kind of felt like, well, it's now or never, that energy of the pandemic. And I thought, I'm just going to start my own nonprofit. I just need to do this. I need to see if I can, right? And I've only got so many more years. I should do it now. So I started Compassionate Living, and we have numerous projects under the Compassionate Living umbrella. One is my podcast, my Hope for the Animals podcast. And then there's two projects. One is the Humane Hoax Project, and the other is the Ahimsa Living Project. And that's, of course, the spiritual aspect through the Dharma traditions. It's been really, really a lot of work. I do it all as the executive director, and but it's passionate work. It's my passion, and being able to focus in on the things that I feel are really important to share. So I've really loved that part of it.
I love that, right? When you find what you love to do, you never work another day in your life. I mean, it's so much bigger than just doing something that gets you up in the morning and maybe you get paid for once in a while and all of those kinds of things, but it's so much bigger. And I love some good things were born from the pandemic because AAC as well was born in the pandemic, and lots of other things that still exist and flourish today, good things that came out of that time. And you're absolutely filling a void. So thank you for that, for saying instead of pointing the finger, someone should do something about this. Like pointing the finger, we say toward ourselves and saying, what can I do? I'm gonna start it. I'm gonna do that. So, what we're tackling and what we're talking to, like you're saying the scope when it comes to animal exploitation and use and abuse, it's right under our noses. It's so normalized. Animals are barely considered to be victims, and the scope and the scale is just so enormous. And there's so much we could say just about the human psychology, that what it is that drives humans to use and hurt animals, or so many people who are just funding it, voting with their dollars. But for you, when you think about this, why are animals so exploited and victimized? How do you explain it, I guess, in sort of a condensed way?
Yeah. Well, I would start by saying, we came to the place that we are now out of necessity, right? I mean, there were people in the past that were hungry, that were starving. They ate what they could eat. And that's understandable. But we're in a very different place now. We're in a very different world now, right? With an abundance of produce and vegan options. And of course, that accessibility isn't abundant for everyone. There can be accessibility issues in certain areas, but for most people, there is an abundance of vegan food. But what's going on is that there's systems of structural violence, and one of those is speciesism. This is a word I like to talk about and introduce. Speciesism is, you could think like racism or sexism or homophobia. It's this collection of like attitudes and ideas and beliefs that one species is dominant or more important than another, right? It can even be subconscious cultural and psychological patterns that put humans superior to other beings, to other animals. Because of this attitude, horrific exploitation happens to animals worldwide. And once you start thinking about it, once you start kind of putting that name to it, you see it everywhere, right? Speciesism. And veganism is kind of an ethical practice that disrupts that system, disrupts the systems of oppression and violence to non-human animals. To me, it's bigger than just avoiding meat, dairy, and eggs. I mean, that's a place to start. That's the economic boycott, right? That's at its heart. We want to avoid meat, dairy, and eggs. That's an important part. But I think it goes broader than that with, like you're talking psychologically, with our language. Recognizing speciesism is this first step of seeing the larger framework of systematic violence, confining, exploiting, killing animals. So speciesism, I think, is an important thing to look at, an important thing to disrupt.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, because it's so the norm, people don't really recognize it's just, right in front of them that way. And it's so, the idea that it's illegal to kick a dog, but it's legal to kill a pig, and those arbitrary lines that are drawn. And so we're really looking at something so large that it's really about evolving, right? It's really about taking blinders off. The other thing I like, to point out in human psychology is that willful ignorance, because I think so much of why, in your books, you talk about, things that people are unwilling to look at, that deliberate sort of avoidance of information or knowledge. And the truth is uncomfortable, but that doesn't change it. Just because it's uncomfortable or not looking at it, not paying attention to it doesn't change it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, it's like you said, much more comfortable to just go along with the status quo and not think about it and put all those rationalizations in place. We were meant to eat animals. It's okay. They don't suffer that much. They were put here for us, for our purposes. All those excuses that we use, because if you look at the hard truth, it is very disturbing and very upsetting that we're causing so much suffering. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about veganism is that we can have that awakening to the suffering and do something about it, right? We don't have to participate in that suffering. We can remove ourselves from it. We can boycott it and be vegan and live vegan. So,
Your books, you've written two books, and I admire that in and of itself because what it takes to put a book together, how long it takes, the effort it takes, and then executing that in a way that there's a real thing, a material thing that's out in the world with that information in it. Your first book is called The Ultimate Betrayal. Is There Happy Meat? Great title, very compelling, right? And your second, The Humane Hoax, Essays Exposing the Myth of Happy Meat, Humane Dairy, and Ethical Eggs, which you edited. So through your books, you're dedicated to raising awareness and educating the public about realities of normalized animal exploitation. And I just want to personally thank you again for addressing the plight of farmed animals through your books. And I encourage folks to read them for a deep dive, which we can't do as much of today, but really this is your life's work. So they complement one another, the two books, certainly. But what is the main message in The Ultimate Betrayal? I know you wrote that with your husband, Kojin, and I know there's a lot of peer-reviewed research. A lot went into it around mislabeling and misinformation surrounding farming methods and animal processing. So talk some about that.
yeah, the first book, The Ultimate Betrayal, I wrote, it's been, I think, 12 years now. It was 12 years ago, but there's still very relevant information in it. And then the follow-up was The Humane Hoax, which I edited. There are 18 contributing authors, 18 different essays that are in the book. I have a chapter as well. I wrote the introduction and the conclusion as well. And the Humane Hoax, this issue to me is one of the reasons why I really wanted to start my nonprofit. Because I've been vegan for 35 years, I saw this transition in real time. 35 years ago, the labels that we saw were things like fresh and young. Those were kind of the labels that were on meat, right? And I saw this gradual transition to things like you'd see then family farmed or, cage free have started coming around, right? So you'd start seeing these labels that were coming in to kind of appease consumers, right? As we were doing the work as animal activists of exposing the horrors, the marketers were kind of doing the work of, shifting the language. And so like 20 years ago, I was seeing this happening and I was starting to talk about it, but nobody really seemed in the animal advocacy community really seemed to care. They just wanted to focus on, the big industrial. They just wanted to focus on the bigger picture. But I started researching it and writing little articles about it because I just felt that it was an important aspect and something that we probably were going to have to deal with in 20 years, which I was correct. That it was just going to grow. So basically, the humane hoax, it's all the new labels, new marketing techniques that animal products have that convey this kind of false sense that there's some improvement in the industry or some improvement in the farming method. But what I learned through the extensive research that I did, and I actually went to, this is back 15 years ago, I went to cage-free operations. I went to standard conventional operations for battery caged hens. I went to organic dairies. I really went actually to these places and did the research directly myself, visually and hands-on. And then I also interviewed numerous stakeholders, people that had worked for these operations, veterinarians that worked for the operations, things like that. And what I found again and again was that there are inherent cruelties that are basically universal to making a product profitable, right? If you want your eggs or your dairy to be profitable in the market, I mean, of course, these things cost a little more. Organic, cage-free cost a little more, but if you don't want it to be outrageously more expensive, then there are these inherent procedures and cruelties that they just can't not do. They can't avoid. Separation of families, slaughter at a young age. They still slaughter them at such young ages. Painful body mutilations. All these things are inherent and they just can't change those things and make a product profitable. So I found that across the board. Now, where they do have a little wiggle room is the size of confinement, right? That's where they can make some changes and some improvements. And that's why there's so much emphasis now on cage free, because they do have a little wiggle room with that. But what ends up happening, like cage-free eggs is a great example, is that all of the issues they face, all the suffering that they face gets funneled into this one thing, the size of their confinement. And as long as they have enough space or you give them a little more space, then everything's okay, right? They're happy now. No, that's not the situation. Cage-free operations, yeah, they're out of the cages, but they're still, crammed together, overcrowded in these windowless warehouses where they never see the sun, where they're still breathing the ammonia of their waste. I mean, there's still horrible situations with cage free. And there's studies that there's higher mortality rates in cage free. More chickens die before slaughter, like die in the operation in cage free facilities than in battery cage facilities. So I think that we're appeasing ourselves. People, don't want to hurt animals, and that's a good thing. We have that on our side. But unfortunately, these labels are deceiving, they're misleading, and the industry is lying to us. The essay book, The Humane Hoax, the anthology, I had 18 contributing authors from all different aspects. There's essays from academics, from animal rescuers that do direct rescue from these smaller operations and differently labeled operations. It's really got a wide variety of aspects and angles, and so you get a lot of information with that one, with both books.
Yeah, absolutely. A wide range of information. And I'm so glad you pointed out that you've been to these places yourselves. You're not just speaking from research or even footage, which the footage is all out there. Absolutely, undercover whistleblower footage, but you've actually been there and seen it with your own two eyes in that way. And so that gives another level of legitimacy to what, you're saying in the books. It's just so twisted that people are sitting in boardrooms making these deliberate choices to market this way. And if there was transparency, if they could be transparent, if it was good, what they were doing, and they could be transparent then, but not. So, as you say in the books, it's really more to ease people's conscience. People don't look further than just these labels that are made up labels, and they make people feel better. They ease their conscience for a while. But the bottom line, as you said, universally is money and profit. So say again what some of the labels. So we want people to look out for free range, and I think the new one you said was responsibly raised or farm raised or humane certified, cage free. And you're saying basically they're meaningless, or the meaning is arbitrary. It's assigned by these businesses.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because now, cage free, free range, these have been out for a while, about a decade, or more. And from the work that I've been doing and others have been doing, they're kind of getting debunked and exposed, right? So the industry is kind of changing even now to different things like responsibly raised. You're seeing this now. So, the language keeps changing, but what doesn't change is the suffering of the animals. The conditions are not what's changing. And I did want to talk just about something specific that I think is interesting, having the animals out to pasture, right? Because that's another thing that, like having a larger confinement area. A lot of things people are looking for is, oh, was it grass fed? Were they outside? Was it free range? Did they have access to outside, right? And people romanticize this out to pasture kind of perception and thinking that, oh, well, as long as they have access to the outside, then it's okay, right? They're having a good life. But that's not necessarily the case. These are domesticated animals. They're not wild animals. You can't just put them outside and, assume that everything will be fine. There's a range of issues that they can face and sometimes suffer even worse when they are outside. There was this really very well done meta-analysis, a study that looks at a series of other studies and comes to a conclusion. That's a meta-analysis. And it was called the Animal Welfare and Production Challenges Associated with Pastured Pig Systems. It looked at like pork production, free range pork production, organic pork production, any pork production where the pigs had access to the outside and were outside. And it found that pigs were exposed to extreme temperatures in the summer. They could get heat stress without being able to get adequate shade. They would get painful sunburn, blistering. And then in the winter, there could be extreme cold, frostbite. They found piglets that had hypothermia and pneumonia. Being outdoors makes them more vulnerable to predators. They also have more contact with wildlife and pathogens, parasites, viruses, avian flu, right? I mean, we are seeing that just devastate the industry right now. That has to do, I mean, that can get worse. That can be exacerbated by having birds outdoors. And we see that with backyard egg operations having avian flu issues. So just because the animals had access to the outdoors, were outdoors some of their life or all of their life, that doesn't mean that, all the issues are alleviated, that all suffering is not there. There are even new things, even worse things that could occur in these new operations, even though, of course, animals were farmed outside for many, many, many years. The indoor is a new development. We're just kind of going back to the old way, which was no better for the animals. Anytime you are exploiting, confining, killing an animal for their flesh or their bodily fluids, there's going to be suffering.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you pointed that out, especially for folks who are unfamiliar with this. You're right. When you just think about outside, we think about farms as being outside, so it just triggers like they must be okay, they must be better off, they must be happier if they're outside, and that is just absolutely not the case. No matter how you frame it, it's the same for the animals in their short lives of suffering, and at the end of the day, they all wind up in the same slaughterhouses. And I'm saying that thinking, please, folks, stay with us. Do not click away from this because I know this is, again, the truth is uncomfortable to hear, but we're attempting to cause a ripple effect in such a way that things actually change. And, these marketing professionals put such a happy face on what they're doing. And it's insult to injury. It's such insult to injury. I can give you an example. Every day I pass billboards for Chick-fil-A. It upsets me and angers me so much when I see I mean, there's a million of those out there, but those particular billboards that I see that I pass every day, I've literally gotten into the habit of just sort of like blinding myself to it, trying not to see it until I'm past it, because what they have is these billboards of a cow painting on, as if he's painting on the billboard, eat more chicken. And it is such a horrible, first of all, they're making cartoons out of animals to remove people from real animals, real individuals. And then there's such a disconnect from the reality, the horrors of the reality of these animals versus this, sanitized cartoon version. Ha ha ha. Isn't it cute that the cows want us to eat more chickens? Reminds us of, how humans, as you say, these animals are domesticated. They're dependent on us, and yet we're the ones who betray them. The very
Right.
hands who brought them into this world are the ones who will take them out of this world. We could take that power and save animals, protect animals, have mercy, and yet we oppress. And
Yeah.
so that's the worst of humanity, and we're trying to appeal to certainly the best of humanity. So do you have any other examples? I'm sure you have a million of those ads.
Yeah, those Chick-fil-A ads, they drive me crazy too. And how insulting to think that a cow would say, "Oh, eat this other animal instead of me." It's just horrible. Yeah, I hate those ads too. I totally get that. I guess for another example, I think I'd love to tell a story. This story is around goat dairy and goats. Part of the humane hoax is that when it's a different species of animal, not the typical cow, pig, chicken, turkey, those are the four main animals that we exploit and kill for food. When it's a different species, buffalo meat, buffalo burgers, whatever, or sheep cheese or goat dairy, we suddenly think it's better for some reason that, oh, well, it's probably a smaller operation or they're doing it better in some way. But all those same inherent cruelties that I was talking about apply to any species, any operation. So this was a small goat operation. They had very few animals. It was a goat dairy, and this mama goat was having a difficult birth. So the owners of the dairy took her to UC Davis. They have a veterinary school there, and they take in animals in distress. So they brought her there. And through a very difficult birth, she gave birth to two babies. She had twins, a little girl and a little boy. And everybody was relieved and very happy. And the owners said, okay, well, we'll take her home and we'll take the female home, but you can dispose of the male. You can just kill the baby male. And the veterinary team was like, okay. And they left with the baby female. And here was this little newborn baby goat, a little boy, who they had just spent hours bringing into the world. He was perfectly healthy. And the team was like, well, we're not going to kill this baby, so they started making phone calls. And they called my friend Deb, who has Goatlandia. Goatlandia is a goat animal sanctuary in a farmed animal sanctuary that kind of specifically focuses on goats, although they have numerous species of animals in Santa Rosa, California. They're expanding to a second location in Sebastopol. And Deb, she said, we'll come get him. We're on our way. And they got in the truck, drove, 2 hours out to Davis to pick up this little guy. They named him Tucker. And Tucker was just adorable. I have some beautiful pictures of Deb and Tucker, where he just grew to be a wonderful, sweet goat playing on the play structures. But the point is that the baby males, they're worthless to the dairy industry. They don't give milk. You only need a very small amount of males for insemination to artificially inseminate and get the females pregnant. So most of them are killed when they're babies, when they're newborns. It's just such a disregard for precious life. And that goes on in any kind of dairy operation, no matter the label, no matter the species.
Yeah, it's absolutely. You could have said that was the life of a baby cow, or it's the same basic story. And so that's really important to point out because, there's a cultural element to different animals and different places certainly are seen different ways. And so we want to just really remind folks that this is absolutely what is happening and so sad in that way. So can you give us an example? And then we're gonna segue to something a little different in our conversation. But can you just give an example of greenwashing? Because I know it's related to humane washing, the same kind of marketing practice where companies falsely claim and exaggerate that there's environmental benefits of their products or services, and it's really done to appeal to environmentally conscious consumers.
Yeah. Yeah, greenwashing, you're right. It's a huge part of the humane hoax, and both my books have a huge greenwashing section with extensive information and really good science and stats. But greenwashing, now we're talking about labels like sustainable or grass-fed or regenerative grazing. That's a new one that we're seeing now, more and more regenerative animal farming. Animal products, when you are raising animals for food, it's just more resource intensive no matter how you do it, no matter what the label is. You're still taking plant food that could be going directly to people, that land could be going to raise, vegetables and fruits and grains that we eat. And you're taking that land and you're using it to feed animals. So there's a middleman. And then that animal produces meat, dairy, or eggs in much smaller numbers, much smaller calorie content than the original food. So we're just wasting water, grain, resources, the land space, right? The acreage of land. It's all being wasted to funnel down to animal products that is inefficient. A lot of times with these labels, both ethically and environmentally, it's just kind of neutral. Nothing really changes but the language. Nothing really changes but the way they're talking about the process. But there can be small changes sometimes, like with cage-free, where maybe it's kind of neutral. It's not really that much better for the animals. But in some instances, it can be even worse. And grass-fed beef is one of those instances that we're really finding now that the science is coming out, we're really finding that it actually can be worse, right? There are studies out of Oxford and Harvard and Washington State and numerous others now that have found that grass-fed beef can produce 50 to 60% more greenhouse gas emissions than conventional beef farming. What? It even wastes more water. And it's just so frustrating because why do people reach for the grass fed? Why do they pay more for a grass fed burger? They think it's more environmental, but we have been duped and fooled into this. It is not. And now the science is coming out that it is not. And these scientists have compared conventional beef and grass fed beef, and grass fed across the board requires more land, more water, more fossil fuels, and produces more greenhouse gases. So this is one of those situations where the label's not just neutral, it's worse. So we really can't rely on these labels. What we do know is that when you choose plant foods, it's always going to be better, no matter the label, no matter where it came from, no matter the farming method for the animals. Every time they do these life cycle assessments where you analyze the food from birth to death for animal products, from planting to harvest and production for plant foods. And anytime they make these comparisons, plant foods always win. They're always lower on, resources and greenhouse gases, considerably lower. So that's where we need to look. If we really want to eat more ecologically, if we really want to help with the greening of our food, then plant foods, vegan is the best.
I think that is so important and so largely unknown by the massive population, what you just shared, because we're assuming and just trusting these large bodies of authority that they're telling us the truth. And it's completely backwards. Like what, they're saying it's better and it's actually worse a lot of the time. And so I want to highlight again your two books, The Ultimate Betrayal and The Humane Hoax, because there's so much in there. Let's segue to that because we were saying again at the bottom sort of the underlying issue here, in some ways we could say there's a crisis of apathy sort of happening in the world that didn't just start overnight, of course. And there's history for lots of times in history where humans and animals, of course, were treated poorly. But, in some ways, we could say that a lack of compassion or a lack of empathy or a lack of humanity, being humane to one another as well as animals, is what we're seeing here. So, as we segue to sort of the intersection between compassion and kindness and nonviolence and spirituality, because to me, when I step back, and I think you too, and zoom out, I see life through a spiritual lens, broadly. And compassion and kindness and respect and empathy to me are aspirational spiritual qualities. So let's start with, since your organization is Compassionate Living, talk about what compassion is and what it is as it relates to everything you were just sharing. And obviously, empathy and compassion are slightly different, both important though. And how important it is that we don't just use words like compassion, but we have to follow that with action. Action means more than words, right? It's the follow-up.
Yeah, this gets into a lot of stuff that's really very deeply interesting to me and important to me. And that is really that veganism, it's a change of what we do, right? We avoid meat, dairy, and eggs. And that's a great thing to do. It's a great place to start. But I think that we have to also change who we are as people, who we are as a culture, as a society, what our priorities are, what we care about. And I love the concept of ahimsa. Ahimsa is a word that means nonviolence or non-harming. It comes from the Dharma traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. Jainism is another Southeast Asian religion. And ahimsa, it's kind of defined as the ethical solution to all conflict, nonviolence, the nonviolent path, really taking nonviolence to a level that no matter what your situation is, and you look at that situation, take the nonviolent path, right? Ahimsa. And I really love that. And vegans are really resonating with this concept of ahimsa. You're starting to really see the word everywhere. You see the word, on jewelry and t-shirts and stuff in the vegan community, because I think it's really resonating with us, and it represents how I think vegans feel on that spiritual level. Like when you want that kind of spiritual connection to nonviolence, ahimsa is really this beautiful concept. And there's really interesting parallels actually between Dharma traditions and veganism. And I get into that with my ahimsa living project under Compassionate Living. And one of the ways is language and the word ahimsa. Ahimsa, there's this term, ahimsa paramo dharma, which means basically that ahimsa, nonviolence, is like the highest law of the universe or the most important factor in your ethical outlook, right? And why is it that these ancient cultures use the word ahimsa as the most important thing? Why not compassion? I mean, there's a Sanskrit word for compassion, karuna. There's actually several Sanskrit words for compassion. Why isn't that the highest principle? Compassion's very important, right? We have to be compassionate. Well, I think it's the same reason why our message as animal advocates, why our message is go vegan, live vegan. We don't say be a compassionate person, right? That's not our message. I mean, of course we say that. That's part of the message, but it's not our main message. It's not our highest message. Compassion is a place to start. But if you're a compassionate person, you can still do harm. You can still eat animals. You can still, there's a lot of people out there that say they're compassionate people, but unfortunately they're doing things that harm animals, harm the planet, right? Lots of people who eat animals consider themselves compassionate people. So our message is not to be compassionate. Our message is to be vegan because it's an action. You're actively avoiding animal products, actively causing no harm. And that's what ahimsa is. Nonviolence, cause no harm. So there's no room for contradiction. There's no like wiggle room to deceive yourself, right? You have to take that action and actually avoid animal products. It's clear being nonviolent, and Ahimsa takes it even further than vegan. It's being nonviolent in your words, in your thoughts, in everything that you do, every action you take every day, to consider what the nonviolent path is, what would cause the least harm. So anyway, I love all that stuff. Yeah.
I love that too. I love that too. I think if more people understood ahimsa as a way of being in the world and thought about it from that higher perspective, and it's so universal, it's almost like it encompasses, I want to say the golden rule, but it's so much more than that. It really encompasses how we can all thrive together, how we can all thrive together and share this planet. And it's spiritual and it's human and it's practical. And you're right, it's action oriented. Yeah, do no
Yeah.
harm. And it also it's what you're saying, direct harm or indirect harm.
Yes.
So you don't get a pass. Not that we're
That's
judging
right.
people at all, but I wouldn't I wouldn't want anybody to give me a pass just because there's a chain that the harm is the result is sitting in front of me, but someone else did the direct harm as well, right?
That's right.
And
That's right. And actually in the ancient literature, they talk about that. They talk about how, even if it's removed from you, if a butcher is butchering, that is still harm. You're still causing that harm. When you are economically supporting, when you are giving money, or even just promoting, having, the food and offering the food to others, that's still participating, being complicit in the harm.
yeah, it's wonderful because all the arguments, all the pushback that we get when we talk to people about veganism and standing up for animals, if we can boil it down to ahimsa, then it sort of, there's no more gray area. People tend to over talk and over explain and over justify why they're still participating in this systemic violence. But this boils it down to where we can all sort of agree. There's some level at which we can all agree as humans that we don't want to hurt others. We don't want others to hurt us. Do no harm. And that circle of compassion needs to be widened to animals and not just some species, but all species. But I want to backtrack a bit because I don't want to assume that people understand what a Dharma tradition is. So can you say just a little bit? I find it fascinating what a Dharma tradition is, and the religions that are included in that are Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and others.
Yeah, so the Dharma traditions are the Southeast Asian religions, mostly out of India. Buddhism and Hinduism are really the two that we mainly know in the West. Jainism is a third that we don't know as well. The things they have in common are really, they have a lot of things that they disagree on. Like, is there a God? Is there not God? Do we have an individual soul or not? There's differing opinions within those things, but the thread that they do all have in common is like karma and ahimsa. These are things that they all agree on, that ahimsa is incredibly important, nonviolence in how we live our lives, and also karma. And I think that on some level, most everyone can agree that what we put out into the world is what we're going to get back, right? What we put out, we get back. That's karma in a very basic form, right? So it's very important that we don't want to cause harm because then harm could come to us. And the other thing that I love about the Dharma traditions is that there isn't so much of a species barrier as there is in Western thought of human superiority, right? Getting back to speciesism. The Dharma traditions, animals, your soul, your jiva, as the Jains call it, your individual soul, can go to reincarnate into other animals, and we feel the animals are kindred spirits and very much in equality with, in certain ways. We all have different aspects and different qualities, but certainly that humans aren't superior in some way, so that I always love that about the Dharma traditions, is that animals are seen as very important to this world, that we should not harm animals in any way. And of course, some of the longest vegetarian societies come from India, and it's because of these Dharma traditions.
where do you sit on this? And maybe you don't at all, but there's this maybe truth that we're all energy, right? Everything is energy, and energy cannot be destroyed. And sometimes we'll hear people say that when you're ingesting animals, you're actually ingesting, to some degree, incorporating their energy and even maybe the energy of their pain or the energy of their fear, or the energy of the violence. And I mean, I'm sort of oversimplifying it maybe a little bit, but where do you sort of sit on that?
Yeah. I agree. I feel that that is absolutely true. I love sci-fi, and there's like the idea of the force, right? And this comes into some of the Dharma traditions where, like you said, everything has an energy or a force, right? And it flows through us, and it's part of everything. And yeah, when we cause suffering, when an animal dies, and there's, to some degree, there's also, various hormones of fear and anxiety that occur at the time of death, and with a violent death like it is at a slaughterhouse, that goes into the meat, or the stress that the animal is feeling in the industrial milking that goes into the milk. Yeah, absolutely. That suffering can transmit into that animal product and can go into us. And, not to get too metaphysical, but it could be part of the collective anxiety that we're feeling and the collective suffering that so many of us are going through. I mean, we're causing so much suffering. We're taking that suffering into our bodies. And then we have a planet of violent, suffering people. Well, maybe there's some connection there. Even if it's not on a metaphysical level, it is, I believe, on a subconscious level that we know we're causing these animals suffering. When you're eating meat, it's a dead animal, an animal that died at a slaughterhouse. On some level, even if you have blocked it out, you know that animal suffered. You know you caused that suffering, right? And so then, we're going to carry that guilt and that pain and that suffering into our bodies and into the world. So this is a cycle that I think is part of the larger problem of our whole planet, that, we could possibly eliminate and have a much more peaceful planet if we could have a global transition to a vegan diet.
There's just so many ways of looking at this, but generally we're saying there's always cause and effect. You can never turn that off, that every action has an immediate and far-reaching reaction, and so nothing exists in a vacuum. And whether you want to accept it or not, we're all interconnected. We are a web. We are one field. So what I do right now, as we have this conversation, is affecting you, people in our immediate circle, and ripples out and out and out in that way. So when the idea of karma doesn't dissuade people from non-harming, because maybe they think it's very abstract. It's very abstract. Maybe something bad will happen to me, if that's true, in some far distant future. No, the effects are now too. And in our health, that's karmic. And like you said, there's this global mental health crisis as well. So maybe that's the guilt part of it that we're carrying. And we'll never have peace on earth until we make peace with animals.
That's beautifully said. Yeah.
So I hope that people will really let all of that sink in. There's so much more to be said around that. But let's transition into a few other things. And so as we want to reach people about being vegan, living vegan, there's a lot of misconceptions about veganism being very hard and very inconvenient and all of the excuses. But I found going vegan to be a pleasure. I embraced it like a challenge in some ways. Oh, there's a learning curve about, what new choices to make. But I remember embracing that and just being curious. And what is maybe one tip that you might give someone who is thinking now that they're going to go vegan?
So I would say to take it slow, it doesn't have to happen overnight. If you want to do it overnight, that's great, but for most people, it needs to be kind of a gradual process, eliminating this and that until you're there. So, do what you need to do to make it comfortable for you. But in that process, don't beat yourself up if you slip up. right? I mean, if you one day slip and you have something, some people will be like, oh, well, forget it. I can't be vegan. No, it takes time. Just like anything, quitting smoking can take several tries, right? So you just kind of, forgive yourself and go on. I'll tell my ice cream story. When I went vegan in 1990, I was dedicated to it. I was telling everybody I was vegan, but I was having major ice cream cravings. And this is a time, granted, that there was no vegan ice cream. There was just coming out Rice Dream was coming out, and it was horrible. It was like icy and yucky and did not do the trick for me. And so I would actually go every now and again. I couldn't take it anymore, and I would go and get a pint of like Haagen-Dazs or Breyers or some ice cream, and bring it home and eat the whole pint guiltily. And I felt so bad, and I would just kick myself for it and get really mad at myself. And I look back and I wish I hadn't have done that. I mean, maybe that's part of getting there, but I got there. I finally got to the point where I didn't crave it anymore. I didn't want it anymore. I found other sweet things that were vegan to satisfy myself. I think the thing, though, to keep is that I was vegan in my heart. Like, I really wanted to be vegan. I kept the reasons and the animals alive in my spirit, and I wanted to be there. So just kind of keeping that spirit alive of wanting to be vegan and forgiving yourself for any slip ups. Also, too, another thing I would say is, and I often say this to new vegans, know that your family and your friends, as much as you're going to want them to understand, as much as you're going to want them to go vegan with you, it's possible, possibly likely that they will not, and that they will be resistant, and that they may, have some pushback. Just be aware of that. Family and friends can be very hard when people are first going vegan. You think, oh, well, if they just knew, right? If they just understood what's going on, of course, they're compassionate people. They're going to, well, unfortunately, that's not the case. 35 years for me, I've been vegan 35 years, and I have had zero anyone in my family go vegan or even close to caring. That can be tough. My advice about this is to find your vegan tribe, find people that do care, find people that do want to hear about it. Get that support, right? Find vegan friends. You got to have that support and love and be able to feel that camaraderie of vegan people, even just one other person that you go out to lunch with every now and again. It's so important. So yeah, those are my tips.
Those are great. Those are great tips. So just to sort of recap that, find community, release any expectations, I'll call it that, of family and friends. Have lots of self-compassion and patience with yourself. Keep your why in mind and look for those delicious vegan brands. Folks, they're out there. They're everywhere. They're on the shelves. Really, they are. So, what
Good job,
can,
Michelle. I just have to say
oh,
that was really such a great wrap up. I mean,
thank
you were
you.
like AI giving a bullet point of what. Good job.
I think my mind works that way. It just as we wrap up, any final words, Hope? Any, for leaving on a positive note, does anything seem really promising and hopeful right now that you have seen?
So I feel very lucky to have the perspective of 35 years of veganism and activism. We've come so far, and I don't think that a lot of people that just went vegan within the last 10 years or so, I don't think they realize how far we've come. Back, in the 90s, whenever I'd talk to someone about veganism, about me being vegan, the reaction was they didn't know what I was talking about, like they didn't even know the word. And I'd have to kind of educate them, or it was always a negative reaction. You'd be the butt of the joke, or, they had some negative reaction, right? Almost always. That has changed so dramatically. I mean, that can happen, but mostly, people do know what vegan is, right? You never really have to explain what that is to someone. And the other thing that's really positive is that people now, I'll get people saying things like, oh, well, we drink almond milk. Something like that is kind of a common reaction now. And what they're saying is, yeah, you're right. We should do that more, or that's a good thing. So different than it was 35 years ago. So that's really exciting. Seeing so many more vegan products, of course, and vegan options. Back in the 90s, if you wanted a vegan cookie, you had to bake it. There was pretty much nothing. So we've come so far in that aspect as well. And also in our attitude towards animals. That has changed. Our attitude and our relationship to animals, that's really changed dramatically. Disasters, like natural disasters. Back 30 years ago, when there were natural disasters, you couldn't take your animal with you to the shelter or in the boat that was rescuing you. You had to leave your animals. That has changed. Now we know, of course, you have to rescue the animals. That's new. I don't think people realize that. Governments around the world are recognizing the consciousness, the sentience of animals in their legislation, like in their written legislation. I mean, it's huge. Hopefully, eventually it'll reflect in how we treat non-human animals. It hasn't quite gotten there yet, but it's starting. It's that foundation of recognizing that animals are sentient, that animals are conscious, that animals should not be killed for our products and pleasure. So I've just seen so much progress having this long-term perspective, and I think that really helps me to be hopeful, right? And it just gets me excited for where we're going to be in another 35 years.
Very, very nice. So we're further than we think, according to you, having a longer view. Thank you. That is hopeful. And I appreciate that we're in that phase. So it's really been absolutely delightful to talk to you. And as we close, you need to know that I appreciate the books you've written. I love your podcast, which I follow closely. I share your positive attitude. I admire your spiritual work in the world. And of course, I want to spotlight your tireless dedication to improving the lives of animals. It's truly a pleasure to know you. And thank you for being on the Animal Liberation Hour.
Well, thank you, Michele. Thank you for all you do. It takes a village, and I appreciate your work as well. Thanks so much for having me.
I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with Hope Bohanec. Her depth of knowledge inspires me, and I'm so grateful she is one of the good ones fighting for the animals.